Welcome to the Empower Podcast, the show where we discuss big ideas with leaders and change makers as we work to create a Mississippi where everyone can rise. This is Grant Callen. Thank you for joining us. Welcome back, friends. In today's show, I take a point of personal privilege to explore a topic that I'm fascinated by. But I'll admit, it's a bit off the beaten path from our usual focus. Today's episode is all about the U.S. national parks. And I'll warn you up front, we had some technology challenges. So the video quality isn't quite up to our usual standards. But Joe, our producer, did a great job of making it work, and I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. So let's jump in. A few weeks ago, my wife and our 5 kids and I loaded into our SUV and spent 2 weeks driving across the American West. We hiked through Zion, Bryce Canyon, the Grand Canyon, Arches, Canyonlands, and Capitol Reef National Parks. And like millions before us, we came home with incredible photographs and wonderful family memories. But we also came home realizing we'd spent 2 weeks experiencing something uniquely American. Nearly every country has beautiful mountains, rivers, forests, and canyons, but America pioneered the idea that these extraordinary places should belong to everyone. That idea tells us something important about America. It reflects what the country believed was worth preserving and what it believed a free people owed to future generations. So today we're going to talk about the national parks and explore what they teach us about America itself. My guest today is Dayton Duncan, who has spent more than 3 decades helping Americans understand not only the history of our national parks, but the ideas about America that they embody. Dayton Duncan is an award-winning writer, filmmaker, and historian. He has written 14 books and produced numerous documentaries with Ken Burns, including The National Parks, America's Best Idea. In politics, Duncan served as Deputy National Press Secretary for Walter Mondale's presidential campaign in 1984 and National Press Secretary for Michael Dukakis's 1988 presidential campaign. Born and raised in Indianola, Iowa, Dayton has spent the last 50 years in New Hampshire, where he lives with his wife, Diane. Dayton, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Well, let's jump in. So you've spent much of your career telling America's story. When did the national parks become a personal passion for you?
Well, I guess they became a passion for me long before Ken and I embarked on our PBS series on the national parks. As you mentioned, I grew up in a little town in Iowa. Both of my parents worked. We didn't really take vacations per se. If they had a week or 2 off, then they'd paint the house, or we sometimes would go fishing up into Minnesota, but no big trip until 1959. I was just about 10, but not quite. And my mom said, we're going to be doing a big 2-week trip this time, and we're going to go west. And we're going to go to a bunch of national parks, and kind of led me to believe that I was part of the planning. And so, and encouraged me then to get out maps, to write to tourist agencies of the states, to look at the, histories and little bits of background of the places we're going to visit. And we set off with my big sister, who would have been 12, and us piled into my grandmother's car and towing a trailer that we borrowed from neighbors and stocked with tents that we were borrowing and camping equipment and all that kind of stuff. And that was just one of the great adventures of my life. I mean, we in true sort of American road trip fashion, We didn't spend a long time in any one place except in the Black Hills where our car broke down early on. Um, but we went to the Black Hills, to the Badlands. We went to the Little Bighorn National Battlefield Monument. We went to Yellowstone. We went to the Grand Tetons. We went to Dinosaur National Monument. We went to Rocky Mountain National Park, and so we're now looping back and heading back to Iowa. And I could take even longer and go almost day by day with you on that trip, even though that was 80, not 80, but 70 years ago. So it was a big experience for me. And it wasn't until later in life when I became a reporter and then a magazine writer and then book writer. And a lot of my books were about traveling in the United States, particularly in the West, writing about the people I met, but also the history of those places. That I didn't come back as a 9-year-old saying, I now think that I'm going to be a writer, that I'm going to spend my time and my energy trying to come to grips with this majestic continent that we inhabit and call our own, and the history of it. I didn't think that at the time, but looking back, I think the seed for that was planted by my mom when she planned decided that's where we're going to splurge on a 2-week vacation, and encouraged me to read books and other things to prepare for it. So anyway, that was, the hook was in. I love the park. I love the fact the reason we were going there is because we could afford it. Then, so on a number of my books, a lot of those took me, traveling along the Lewis and Clark Trail for my first book, a book about the most sparsely settled counties in the United States for another one. A lot of those brought me to national parks. I fell in love with them. But I'd been working with Ken for about 10 years, I guess, on writing and producing documentary films with him. And I came up with the idea that a good series for us might be about the national parks. But it took me, the previous film that we had done had taken me 10 years to convince him that we ought to do it. When I came up and sat down with him here in Walpole and said, I've got an idea for a series, and it started to explain about the national parks and that it was started by Abraham Lincoln, his favorite president, during the Civil War, also a topic of interest to him, and that it was linked to the Declaration of Independence, the document that both he and I hold very sacred. And about 45 seconds into the pitch, he said, well, let's do it. And we wanted to, we didn't want the film to be a travel log. In other words, we'd say, tonight's episode is Yellowstone, and we'll tell you, about the geological formations and the wildlife, and we didn't want it to be, not that there's anything wrong with that, but or just a quote nature film, though nature would be part of it. We didn't want it to be about here are the best lodges to stay in. I said this is an American idea. As Wallace Stegner said, it was the best idea we ever had as a nation. But I said it's actually an idea that springs from us as a nation, and I want to tell the story of the evolution of that idea, and the people who helped convince Congress to set aside these special places. And so for the next, 6 years or so, my job as the producer and the writer was to go to all the national parks and try to talk to people about the story behind that park. My job was to read everything I could about the history. My job was to go back with the film crew to all those parks and meet the people that knew the most about them. And then my job was to write a script for it and then sit down with my best friend, who I think is the best documentary filmmaker of his generation, and create a 6-episode, 12-hour PBS documentary. So it was the best thing that could ever happen to me. I mean, it was my job, I guess, and it was definitely work, a lot of long hours, a lot of work, study and research and sweat.
Well, and what's so amazing, one of many things that are so amazing about these parks is every moment you're there, they're different and ever changing from maybe the day before or even a few hours before. What a great privilege to get paid to go to all the national parks. As you did that, do you have a favorite park? Or is that like asking you, do you have a favorite child?
Well, it is like asking if you have a favorite child. And as we're working on it, that's one of the first questions people would ask me. And I had a true but flippant answer to it. I would say whichever park I am in is my favorite national park.
Yeah.
But then I realized I really needed to think about it a little more. And I realized that when my wife Diane and I were courting and I was working on a book about Lewis and Clark, she flew out to meet me in Montana. And we drove up along the front range of the Rocky Mountains in central Montana and went to Glacier National Park, where we spent 3 glorious days. 12 years later, when we took the product of that courtship on our own trip, that was the first park we went to. And so I got to take a picture of our daughter Emmy sitting at the exact same place that Diane had sat for a photograph in 1980s, in sort of the same pose. I had a wonderful hike with my son Will up to what's called Hidden Lake, right at the Continental Divide, and we encountered a small group of mountain goats. They walked within 5 feet of us as they were going down the trail. His eyes were this big. I was having everybody keep a journal of our trip. And that night, I would sometimes peek at what they did after they went to sleep. And that night in his journal, Will said, "This has been the greatest day of my life." And
wow.
It's burned into my memory. And as you said, you just done the same thing with your kids. And it is that what I think about the parks and particularly taking your kids. I mean, you don't have to have a child to go to the national parks. I went to a lot before
Sure.
I had one. They're still spectacular, but there's something about that generational thing where, it is ever changing, the atmosphere and dynamics. But the other thing about it is not changing, that we have preserved them for all time, for everybody. And so it's a great place to save a memory, because you can come back to it and the place itself hasn't changed much. You might have, and you've got somebody with you now, a child that can share that with you, which is related to, I think, what I learned in the history of the national parks, which is we take them for granted. We think they've always been there. The government just, comes down and says, we're going to save this place. And in truth, it's the opposite of that. It's most of these national parks, not all, but most, are the result of one person, two people, a small organization falling in love with a place because of its beauty or its spectacular nature or whatever, and falling in love with it so deeply that they want to make sure it's there for other people who they might never meet in generations they would never know the way that they had encountered it. And that's the real power of that idea, is that permanence. Also on that trip, with my family, when I was a kid, we didn't go to glaciers, but other parts we went to places I'd been, with my parents, and one of those places was in Grand Teton National Park, and we had camped at Jenny Lake, which is just right up front of the mountains, just rise, from the shoreline almost. It's a beautiful, spectacular place. And we had camped there in 1959, and for the rest of her life, my mom's eyes would always get a little misty, and talking about that morning, standing on the shore, seeing the sun hit the Teton Mountains, and say that was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. So a generation later, I was standing at the shore of Jenny Lake with my daughter, who's named for my mom. And as I was, holding her hand, looking at that same sight, same beautiful sight, I could, sense or feel time moving through us. And I could remember my hand holding my mom's, 50 years earlier. And time expanded and collapsed, in the same moment. And and I thought to myself, like, this is as close a moment of eternity that I've ever had. It was transcendent. And so that's what the parks make possible, I think. I mean, you can have transcendent moments in your backyard.
Sure.
Particularly with nature, and feel that you're part of something much larger than yourself, and not forget about, at least put aside for a while, all the other distractions, and feel connection to something larger. I guess it's possible to go to national park, and whether you're a kid or an adult or a family, and just say, well, that's pretty nice, and drive on. But I'm not capable of that. And I think that I think they seep into your heart, into your mind, into your soul, and they make that's just a powerful, powerful medicine.
Yeah. That is so well said. I think about, 3 summers ago, we did a similar road trip to the north part of the West and went to the Badlands, and then we went up to Glacier National, and then we did Yellowstone and Grand Tetons. So we've now done 11 parks as a family, and Glacier National is one of those where you just it is so awe-inspiring and so, as you put it, powerful and sobering that you just are speechless. And similarly, this trip, when you come through the woods and you walk up to the rim of the Grand Canyon for the first time, I had no words, and nothing could prepare you. I mean, you've seen pictures of Grand Canyon your whole life, but nothing can prepare you for the vastness, the depth, the magnitude of this size. And One of the things I love about your documentary is you really you tell the story of how these parks came to be, and that as you said, there was no guarantee that we were going to protect these places. And one of those stories is sort of the cautionary tale you tell of Niagara Falls.
Right.
Tell that story about how Niagara served as an example of what we didn't want to do, and it ultimately led towards the protection of Yosemite and Yellowstone.
Well, yeah, for many, many years early in our national history, we suffered from kind of an inferiority complex to England and to Europe. We were the, quote, New World and viewed as sort of backward and everything. And we didn't have the, great cathedrals and great other structures of, quote, civilization that that Europe and England had. But we'd always try to say, well, yeah, but we have, at that point, we hadn't really seen all the stuff in the farther west. But I said, but we have something they don't have, which is these spectacular waterfalls called Niagara, right there on our border with Canada. So we would try to, use that as an argument that, well, don't be looking down your nose at us, friend. But when they'd go up there, what they saw was, yeah, it's a beautiful waterfall that's been desecrated by being lined with, all sorts of tourist dreck and people shouting at you to try to, get in their carriage to go along the falls. And they were still pretty spectacular, but it was just a carnival-like experience. And so that got thrown back in America's face about, well, you might have it, but you're not taking very good care of it, are you? So when in the 1860s, when word came back about this place in California called Yosemite Valley and these gigantic ancient trees, the sequoias of the Mariposa Grove, it was suggested that, and partly because it was commercial interest that wanted to be bringing people there, they said, we need to do something that we haven't done before, which is if any kind of sort of public land owned by or claimed by the United States, we're parceling it out into homesteads and privatizing it. And that will ruin this the way that Niagara Falls was ruined. So let's do something a little different. And so Abraham Lincoln signed a law that said this is going to be set aside for, for the enjoyment and not be all parceled up, but entrusted it to the state of California on the promise that it would keep it pretty much as it was. They could have some hotels and a few things, but it needed to be, in essence, preserved. That was that seed was the one that started what became the national park idea. 8 years later, word came back, so it was called the Yosemite Grant. 8 years later, word came back with photographs and an expedition about this bizarre place at the headwaters of the Yellowstone River, where there's mud pots, mud boiling and steam rising and geysers and also tremendous waterfalls. And so the proposal was made again. Well, let's do what we did with Yosemite. It also helped that they said it's no good for farming. There's, so we're not really, quote, losing anything by prohibiting homesteading. And they got that through, and then they said, well, wait a minute, there's no state to give it to. It's in the territory of Wyoming. So more out of happenstance than out of long-term vision, they said, well, we'll make it a national park. The federal government will be in charge of it. Maybe we'll at some point give it to a state of Wyoming if it becomes one, maybe not. And over time, it quickly proved that that was probably a better way of doing it than giving it to a state, because what they found in Yosemite in those early years is they had some commissioners that were in charge, but they were corrupt. Things weren't going well. And they eventually got the state of California to retrocede it back to become a national park years after Yellowstone. But Yellowstone was the first, quote, national park in the history. It was our idea. And as I told Ken, this is the Declaration of Independence applied to the land. It's only a nation founded on the ideals that we were founded on in 1776, probably the world's best idea. People should be able to govern themselves, that all people are equal under the law. They have certain rights. I think only a nation built on that foundation would have come up with the idea that our most spectacular, beautiful, some would say sacred places should not be, as they had been throughout history, the private domain of royalty or the rich or the well-connected. They should be there for everybody and for all time. I mean, it was a radical idea 250 years ago to say, we will govern ourselves.
Absolutely.
And we're doing this by saying that everybody is endowed with certain inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which isn't just the pursuit of not happy times, but the pursuit of happiness means you could decide what you were going to do, not be, not your birth didn't say this is what you will always have to be, that you could pursue your own interests, intellectual or otherwise. And that was a radical idea. And making a national park based, at being a child of that radical idea was just as radical at the time.
Well, and what's interesting to me, and I'm grateful for, is the thread of that idea that these parks are for everyone. That thread still persists today. And I mean, one of the examples of that is this program where and most people may not even know this exists, but if you have a fourth grader, you can get a free national parks pass for a year and see the parks without any entrance fee, just by having a fourth grader, which to me is kind of a way to help encourage the next generation. So keeping families taking their kids to see these amazing places. And we have a fourth grader, and so this year we got one of those passes and didn't pay anything to go to any of these parks.
There you go. That's a great idea. When the National Park Service, there were national parks before there was a park service. That came about in the 19-teens. So, 50 years after Yosemite was set aside, 40 some years after Yellowstone became the first national park, they finally said that, they had been in, basically a lot of times the Army would be in charge, or, they had weird jurisdictions. They said, finally became clear, we need an agency of government whose sole job is to manage these precious jewels. And so the National Park Service was born, and I was asked to be on the committee that the Park Service had to discuss how things about the centennial of it. And one of the ideas that we said is how to get young people involved, and also how to maybe get families involved in that. And it was determined by, educational experts and everything, that fourth grade is could be a really important time. And so from all that came a lot of lesson plans and stuff were developed for fourth graders. And the idea of, I tried to call it sort of a ranger in every, we need to reach out and see, it's like putting a ranger in every classroom for a while. And therefore they made, they couldn't put a ranger in every classroom, but you could always make the classroom the park itself.
Well, so I have you to thank for that. I love that. I didn't know you were on that committee, but that's wonderful. So when we think about the birth of these national parks, often two names come to mind: John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And of course, most people know who Teddy Roosevelt was, but a lot less know who John Muir was.
Yeah.
Who was he, and how did he and Teddy Roosevelt contribute to the park system we have today?
Well, I mean, you just named two people. If there was a Mount Rushmore of national park figures, Mount Rushmore is part of the national park system, but if there was one set aside for carving portraits of individuals for the Mount Rushmore of the national parks, Roosevelt's already in Mount Rushmore, but he would definitely be one of the people that have to be on the parks thing. John Muir was a Scottish immigrant, a brilliant naturalist, an inventor. In 1867, he was working in a factory in Indiana. He'd already studied botany and geology, but his inventing skills brought him into industry for a while. And he had an accident in which a file broke off that he was working with and punctured an eye, and he was blind for about 3 months before when the one eye was injured. Then he had sympathetic blindness, it's called, and the other. So he was in darkness for 3 months, and he was rethinking what his purpose of his life was going to be. And he decided that he wanted to devote it to exploring the natural world, writing about it, and set off on a walk from Indiana to the Gulf of Mexico in Florida.
Whew, that's a walk.
And so he walked there, taking notes about the plant life and writing about it, but also just coming to these profound thoughts about the relationship of human beings and the rest of existence, and the responsibilities of it, but also the possibilities of it. These transcendence that you can feel there, of being connected to these larger things. His original plan was to go then to South America and follow in the footsteps of this great naturalist named Alexander von Humboldt, who was a European naturalist. But he contracted malaria on his walk, that almost died, bedridden for 3 months, and decided, well, maybe going from here to the Amazon jungles is not a good idea. But he'd read about this place called Yosemite and decided to go there instead. So he got on a boat and went to San Francisco. Then he walked from San Francisco into the Sierra Nevada and was transported. I mean, you can see in his writings on his walk through down the east, this budding realization and also the makings of a really great writer. But man, when he got to the Sierra Nevada and the Yosemite Valley and those big trees, it took him to new heights. So his writings became incredibly popular at the sort of the early moments of a national conservation movement, in which there were people who said, "Okay, we've spent the younger quote younger years of our nationhood moving west, privatizing things, doing a lot of damage to the natural world. But there are at least some places where you have to say, stop, no, not here." And he became, a principal voice of that. Then he would go to places. He went up to Alaska and studied the glaciers there, and his writings and magazines about that were so popular that the magazine circulations tripled. They started running tour boats into Glacier Bay. They named the glacier after him. He worked, to help get Yosemite become a national park instead of a state grant. He went and studied Mount Rainier. That became a national park. He went to the petrified forest. He loved trees, and so he was looking at trees that were, millions of years old that are now rock, and studied those. But his writings about that helped get that saved. He was a major and important voice in all of conservation, but particularly national parks. And when he was president, Theodore Roosevelt, who was a great outdoorsman, came to California in 1903. One of the things he really wanted to do was to camp out with John Muir. And so they arranged for that. The president came up and met Muir there. He went by stagecoach into the, just stupefying grove of sequoias called the Mariposa Grove, with these trees that are, 3,000 years old and gigantic beyond belief. And he dismissed everybody else. He had an entourage of his staff, but also other politicians and stuff. And said, "No, I want to." They had accommodations for him at a hotel, not all that far away. But he said, "No, I want to camp out with John Muir." And they spent a night camped at the foot of one of the great trees there. He woke up the next day and wanted to do a dip. He wanted to keep camping. They went to a place called Glacier Overlook, a rock that juts out from the cliffs looking down into the Yosemite Valley and over to two great waterfalls. And they camped there for a night. It snowed on them. Roosevelt woke up and said, "This is bully. This is just great." Went by horseback down into the valley. They had a big grand reception waiting for him at a hotel there. He goes, "No, I want one more night of camping with John Muir." So anyway, that was the most, I like to call it probably the most important camping trip in the history of America, because Roosevelt was already leaning toward conservation, and his time with Muir just supercharged that commitment to preserving special places in our landscape, and also bird refuges. He's the one that then made sure that the rest of the park got to be the old state grant became a national park, and he became our greatest conservation president. He probably, like I say, he had that in him to begin with, but it was those 3 nights, under the stars and the trees with John Muir that really put him over the top.
So we have 63 national parks today. another 430 sites that are protected as part of the national park system, including 9 in Mississippi. So I was thinking through, Vicksburg National Military Park, the Natchez Trace Parkway. I live right off the Natchez Trace Parkway, other historical sites. But these 63 places are all majestic.
Mm-hmm.
How did we decide what would be one of these 63 national parks? And do you think we've closed the book on that? Will there be other places that we decide to make national parks?
Well, to become a national park, Congress has to act to designate it as such. And sometimes that's been easier than other times. You were just at the Grand Canyon and you described what everybody is, how awe-inspiring it is to stand in that chasm and look through as what John Muir called a grand geological library. If you go through the different strata and the different color, you're going through thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years of patient erosion. It was first proposed as a national park, it would have been the second national park in our history in 1882, and Congress wouldn't agree to it. People of Arizona were opposed to it. Certain private interests wanted to exploit it, either for their own gain with tourism, but also extraction of minerals. So it failed. They did two more bills were proposed. Still nothing. They finally were able to make a national forest, call it the surrounding area part of a national forest, but that doesn't have the protections of a park. That 1903 trip of Roosevelt, as I said, on his way to meet John Muir, he stopped at the Grand Canyon for the first time, and was, like everybody else, awestruck by it. And he said, "My advice to the people of Arizona and the people of the United States about this place is leave it as it is. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. Leave it as it is." And he wanted it to be a national park. Still no deal. So he used a thing that had been passed to help preserve Mesa Verde National Park, to protect the cliff dwellings there, because they were being vandalized, and the Congress passed a thing called the Antiquities Act that gives the president the sole authority to designate a national monument with the stroke of a pen of public land that he or she would deem worthy of that kind of protection. And so Roosevelt was the first president. When that was passed, and he set aside Devil's Tower and other places, but then he used it to declare Grand Canyon a national monument. People of Arizona and politicians there howled. One of them took it to court to say that he was exceeded his powers, and even what the wording of the Antiquities Act allowed. Fortunately lost in the Supreme Court. And that was, still 1908, and it still was another 11 years, 1919, before the Grand Canyon, which I would say is probably the most self-evident place to be a national park, even more than Yellowstone. It took from 1882 to 1919 for it to become a national park. And in that is a story. And then, of course, Arizona was, a generation later, they were putting the Grand Canyon on their license plate. Nobody's opposed to it being a national park.
Yeah.
Now, And what that shows is that what makes the Antiquities Act so important, therefore, is that it allows um, a president with vision to act when Congress won't, and at least get things started. About half of our national park, of the 63 national parks versus the larger park system, began their park life as a national monument.
Hmm.
And finally, all the local opposition, no federal control, it's going to be terrible. Uh, you know, mitigate, erodes away and becomes a national park. So um, that's a long-winded, predicate to what your question is. I think, and I very much hope, there are national monuments that would make terrific national parks already in the system. They've expanded some of the newer quote designation as a national park versus just a national thing. The Arch in St. Louis is now
Sure.
a park versus when I went through there with on the Lewis and Clark Trail, it was a national historical monument. I think that there'll be more national parks. The other question then is how well are they taken care of course. We were happy that our film engaged millions of people to say, well, we want to go there too. We get very happy. Any of our films that have the habit of prompting people to say, I want to go to the place where this story took place and see it for myself. It always warms our heart when people write us about doing that, regardless not just national parks, but any uh, any of them, because the other thing that the park system faces is not just how many people come in, but how poorly Congress treats them, and that's been a case from the day when they declared Yellowstone as a national park. They didn't provide any budget for its
Hmm.
upkeep and protection. They just said, well, there'd be a person that would be a sort of a superintendent, and we'll allow a couple of people to build hotels in it, and then we'll just take care of itself. Um, and over the years, there have been times when Congresses in the 30s, right after the Second World War, when there was a big influx of people going, they embarked on a grand program of updating things and making it better, creating visitor centers, not allowing people just to park anywhere they wanted along the road, those kind of things of protecting what it is, but still making it available to everybody. But my view is, if any person that comes to a park, particularly for the first time or comes repeatedly, you're getting somebody who's going to become more likely to become a park advocate, and as such have at least the opportunity to express that through the people that they elect, to say, well, let's take better care of this then. And let's be careful about, we need to have regulations, because it's the enacting law says that they're there for the benefit and enjoyment of the American people. But it's not just you and me today, the American people of today. It's for the American people 1, 2, 3, 4 generations on. So therefore, there has to be regulations and protections. That's not just a free for all.
Yeah.
So those have to be done. And
Yeah.
there's always, all of those are always contested. That's another thing of who we are, right? That's part of the promise and part of the heart, sometimes heartache of the democratic representation.
Well, it was interesting 3 years ago when we went to the parks, Glacier National and Yellowstone. You did have to have a reservation to get in, which was I was glad of, because Yellowstone really was bumper to bumper traffic, and we spent hours and hours sitting in traffic. And it didn't spoil our trip. We had a wonderful time at Yellowstone, but there was noticeable traffic everywhere, and it was very slow moving. But it was interesting. A lot of those reservation systems have gone away. I think there's only one park right now this summer that has a reservation system, which I think is Rocky Mountain National Park. So none of the parks we were at this year in southern Utah had a reservation system, and I was blown away that
even Zion.
Zion did not have a reservation system. It has in the past, but I think it just went away. In fact, at Zion,
it has a bus system. You can't drive up into the thing up in your car. You get on a bus and come.
You can drive through the park, but you can't to the Narrows, where we hiked at the Narrows. You have to take a bus.
Right.
And what blew me away actually about the Narrows, we got up one morning early to try and we had heard about the crowds at the Narrows. We got up with 4 of my children. We actually rented e-bikes, so we biked to avoid the shuttles. Yeah. And then we hiked 13 miles on the Narrows. It was truly a highlight of our trip. But one of the things that stood out to me, about mile, 11 or 12, I remarked to my son, I have not seen one piece of trash. And literally not one piece of trash. And there were, we got up, we were there early enough so that we beat most of the crowds on the way out. And on the way back, we were coming back right after lunch, and you could see, just lots and lots and lots of people, but not one piece of trash. And I was so impressed by that. And I wonder if that is both, the Park Service really doing a good job, but also a sense of stewardship by the visitors who you're so awed by this place, you don't want to leave a single piece of trash.
Yeah. Well, I don't have the answer to that. I hope it's a combination of that part of the mission of the Park Service is to inculcate the visitors with this preservation protection ethic. And they have, I think, quite a bit of success with that. And I think it's partly then, if you're sort of at least aware of it, and you're in the midst of that, and you're, not a jerk, then you'll want to honor it. You still get, I see all the, as they call it, things online about tourons, tourists who are morons.
Yeah.
Who are doing just incredibly stupid and sometimes dangerous and sometimes destructive things in national parks. And, when in the early days of Yellowstone, when they had no real protection, and finally they had to bring the army in to do it. But they had people who would, walk along and carve their names into the formations around some of the geysers. They would put soap, laundry soap, down in the mouth of the geyser, because it would help it. It would prompt it to, erupt. And so that, you could see early pictures of soldiers standing next to, they would wash their clothes in the, in the hot water coming out from the geysers and the fumaroles. You can see pictures of them. And so, and it used to be, when I was in 1959, it was still not uncommon to see cars stopped in Yellowstone and people feeding the black bears.
Yeah.
And the Park Service, over the years, realized that its mission was, had tended to be a little bit too much tourist oriented, and they would feed the grizzly bears at the garbage dump. They had bleachers up around the garbage dump, and every evening there'd be a park ranger there talking about nature and grizzly bears while you watch them come out of the woods and feed on the trash. Uh, Over the years, increasingly became inculcated that the mission of the Park Service was not just for tourists and a experience. It's for protection. It's for nature itself.
Mm.
And so that, like I say, that part of
Yeah.
that dual mandate has always been in play, and can swing back and forth.
Well, Dayton, this has been a wonderful conversation. I have thoroughly enjoyed this. Let me close with this. When a family leaves a national park or leaves a road trip where they've seen national parks, what would you like them to take with them beyond just photographs and memories?
I would want them to take back with them not only those memories, but the remarkable um, history that made that possible. That it's not to take it for granted.
Mm.
First of all, it took work by people to get it preserved and saved in the first place. And just because it's been set aside doesn't mean you can't lose it. Once it's ruined forever. Once it's preserved, it has to be protected forever, because otherwise it will be ruined. And what I hope is they also just come back with this feeling of this. I don't know if gratitude is the right word, but appreciation of that, but also a feeling of responsibility.
Mm.
Like I say, it can't be taken for granted. If you're coming back with your kids, if you want them to be able to take their kids to see that same thing, you have an obligation as a citizen and as I say, a part owner of this, to make sure that it is kept in the right condition and it is supported. I like to say, we're all part owners, regardless of who we are, where we came from, what our financial circumstances might be. We are all part owners of some of the most majestic waterfalls, the grandest canyons, the most spectacular geyser formation in the world, and historical places like that. We are all co-owners of it. That is the great American idea. It belongs to us, it belongs to you, and to everybody, every other you around that. And that's a remarkable thing. And since you are a part owner, maybe you want to go out and check how your property is doing every once in a while, right? There's that. And you have the right to do that. But you also want to make sure that you want to put that legacy, that inheritance that you have, in your will, so that your children can have it, and that they then take on the responsibility to put it in their will. Their children can have it. So if you think of it as an inheritance, you don't want to squander it.
Yeah.
You don't want it to be, I have to watch my words. You don't want it to be, tossed away. You want it to be something that you're lucky enough to have inherited it, and you want to make sure it's taken care of, and that your progeny can inherit it too.
Yeah. Well, that's a great place to end it. Thank you for what the role you have played in preserving these places and celebrating these places and telling these stories. It's important, it's vital, And thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much for listening to today's episode of the Empower Podcast. To learn more about how you can get involved and we can work together to make Mississippi a place where everyone can rise, go to our website at empowerms.org. Please like or subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you'll be notified of future episodes.